Assalamu alaikum, Asim.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Dr. Asim Qureshi, how are you doing?
Yeah, good. How about yourself?
Still out of breath. We were rudely interrupted by a fire alarm.
Indeed.
Flipping it. Shall we head out in case the building's on fire?
Yeah, maybe. Qadar
It looks like someone doesn't want you to say what you're about to say.
I mean, you never know. You
Yeah.
never know.
So Cage has hit the headlines once again,
Yeah.
launching a legal challenge. What can we call it?
Yeah, I mean,
for
it's
the
an
government.
application. It's an
Application
application to the Home Secretary.
Legal application to deproscribe Hamas. So obviously, naturally, my first question is, do you condemn Hamas?
I think you know the answer to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know.
Yeah, I think you wrote a book about it.
I did indeed.
condemning
Well, I mean, I didn't write the whole
politics
book.
of com-
You know, mashallah,
Hopefully you read it at least.
my co-authors, they wrote all the essays in it. But yeah, we refuse to condemn. I mean, what we do condemn is settler colonization, apartheid, racism, ethno-nationalism, which of course is the fundamental nature of the Zionist regime. And so, you know, if you want to condemn anything, you condemn the roots of this intractable situation. And that's what we condemn. And anything that spills out from that is a consequence of the fundamental nature of what Zionism is.
So a month or two ago, Riverway Law, they launched this application to deprescribe Hamas, actually acting on behalf of Hamas. But your application this week is different, right?
That's right. So, alhamdulillah, I was in a personal capacity, I was involved with the Riverway Law application that directly represented the arguments that are being put forward by Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk on behalf of Hamas as an organization, to effectively say that they don't believe that it's right for them to be on the list of proscribed organizations for a whole range of reasons. Yeah. You know, the chief of which, of course, is that Hamas has never operated outside of the occupied territory in terms of their resistance as the Islamic resistance movement. That's really key, because the UK government should be making determinations about the threat that any group poses to the UK itself. Mm-hmm. And, well, really they just simply don't. But more importantly, what the application also does is that it turns the table upside down by saying effectively that, well, you know, Zionism is the issue here. We've got a settler colonial racist apartheid regime, which is completely illegal under international law, that is being supported by the UK government. Not only has the UK government got an obligation not to support such a regime, but actually they have a positive obligation to support any resistance to such a regime as well. So we would go further and argue on behalf of the client, what they want to argue is that the UK government actually has the obligation to support resistance movements that are fighting such causes. And so that's the Riverway Law application. Yesterday, Cage launched our own application to the Home Secretary, which is separate. And in that, what we're effectively arguing is that we have a range of clients, or there are a range of cases that we know of or are involved in some ways, where the prescription of Hamas has affected their ability to express themselves freely in different ways. Either they have been stopped at airports, they've been criminalized in different ways under Section 12, the Terrorism Act 2000, or that regulatory bodies and public bodies have effectively used the environment around Hamas to suppress the freedom of speech and expression of those under their care. So there are many, many, many cases. In fact, the vast majority of cases are not even anything to do with police involvement or any criminal charges. They're just regulatory bodies effectively criminalizing those that are under their purview by effectively sanctioning them in different ways. So it's an issue, but it shows you what the prescription regime does. It has this knock-on effect, this chilling effect throughout the whole of society.
Can you give any examples of that?
Yeah, sure, of course. There are so many examples that we cite, and that's what the application is actually. It's pretty much a whole series of 26 case studies that we present, showing how different people have been affected in different ways. So, for example, you know, somebody expressing from the river to the sea was seen by an NHS trust as being like indicative that they are pro-Hamas and that they support the erasure of Israel. It's just one example of many that really are, kind of give the sense of that this isn't really anything to do with whether or not Hamas is a banned organization. This has got everything to do with the suppression of freedom of speech, of being able to advocate effectively on behalf of the Palestinian cause and Palestinians.
What do you think is going to happen in terms of, okay, you put this application into the Home Secretary. Do you think that somewhere, somehow, there's a kind of maybe an appetite to, or growing or festering within the kind of government or the establishment that we need to kind of, Israel is too costly to support? And, do you think they're going to turn their back on, the Zionist project and just deproscribe Hamas? Or do you think...
I think it's important to put these arguments out there in the public space and that people are aware of what the arguments are. I think we have to raise the ceiling of what can be considered acceptable in public discourse. And the way that we do that is by using whatever tools are at our disposal in order to effectively advocate on behalf of the Palestinian cause in its totality, not just for one group, but just in general as well. Now, whether or not this works, it really is by the by. It's important that these arguments are made and that people understand what those arguments are, because the Palestinian movement is an entire movement. It's not just one singular thing. And so we have to use whatever tools are at our disposal in order to advocate on behalf of that cause. At Cage, we have our own clients, and the fact of our clients being affected by this regime, whether they're Palestinians themselves or non-Palestinians who are trying to advocate on behalf of the cause, it's important that we represent them to the best of our ability. And bringing this application is one way of doing that. Now, what we're seeing currently is that, of course, Zionists are so deranged that they are carrying on this genocide to an extent that now it's become uncomfortable for liberals in the West. Now they come to the stage of a genocide where it's just like, oh, this is getting really awkward for us now.
Genocide-y.
It's very genocide-y, it's kind of getting there, and so we have to do something. And so what you see right now in public discourse, and you've seen this over the last couple of weeks in particular, is this almost overnight shift in public discourse. So politicians coming out and criticizing Israel. You have like very right-wing outlets like LBC. All of a sudden, their commentators who up until now have been very, very, very pro-Zionism have started critiquing Zionism, or at least critiquing Netanyahu, right? And that's the point. What you're seeing is the managed saving of Zionism from itself. Okay, that's what's happening in the West right now. That they're effectively saying, well, Zionism in the way that it's being enacted right now is so utterly deranged that all we can do is effectively try and minimize the critique of the Zionist state. And the way that they do that is by focusing on the Netanyahu government, by focusing on Gavir or Smotrich or any of these figures, as we see with the sanctions that took place yesterday against those two figures in particular. But this is all managed, right? They're trying to manufacture consent that, okay, there are some problems that we're seeing.
Some bad apples kind of discourse.
Apples, right? But Zionism itself is an evil ideology. And while Zionism remains the ideology of that state, then that is the thing that needs to be fought. And that is the issue that we have, really, that, they're trying to manufacture that consent amongst the population to say that, well, we're fair-minded. Well, you're not, because still a genocide taking place. And actually the problem isn't the fact that it's Netanyahu, because every single regime that came before Netanyahu, whatever part of the political spectrum it was on, still fundamentally believed in settler colonization and apartheid, and this is no different.
Do you notice, though, a difference between, not just now, maybe going back months or years, a difference between the tone when it comes to West Bank settler violence and Gaza, even from the likes of David Cameron or other foreign secretaries before him? It seems, I don't know, like qualitatively, they are much more condemnatory in their tone when talking about West Bank, and when it comes to Gaza, it's just, oh, Israel has the right to defend itself.
I think that the scale of the oppression and the repression is so severe that they have no choice other than to take a condemnatory tone. It's the material conditions in Palestine that are resulting in this. And even now, if we see like the sanctions relate to the West Bank, right? And it's really interesting in and of itself. And so we have to think about what's going on here, which is they need to save the state of Israel. And the way that they're trying to do that is by, signaling that they're now open to a two-state solution. But once again, the two-state solution, what it ultimately does is to normalize Zionism, is to normalize apartheid, is to normalize a Palestinian Authority, which is an oppressive arm of Zionism itself, right? Who is doing all the detentions in the West Bank? It's not Zionists that are doing the vast majority of them. It's the Palestinian Authority on behalf of the Zionists. And so we have to understand that these so-called easy wins they're not necessarily wins if this is what the political ambition ends up with, right? And the reality is that, coming back to the application, with any conflict, you have to talk to all sides that are part of that conflict. You have to end up with a negotiated settlement. This is a material reality throughout history. Whenever governments tell you, we don't talk to terrorists, that is absolute nonsense, because in the end, they always talk to those they malign as terrorists. And, we write about this in our application in the introduction. We talk about the work of Sophie Haspasler, who wrote the book Prescribing Peace. And in it, she talks about requiring what's known as a linguistic ceasefire. You can't demonize your opponent to the extent that you keep on calling them terrorists, and you create a system of laws and legislation that malign them as terrorists and make it practically impossible for you to negotiate with them, okay, without keeping everything in its place. What the British government has to do, actually, in order to stop the level of abuse that's taking place there, is to say, well, actually, it was a ridiculous decision for us to prescribe Hamas. Even if it's just the political wing, because we have no route and avenue to play a role in helping to end this situation right now. What they've done is just they made it completely intractable. No one can. And the reality is that they do talk to those who are prescribed all the time. If we look at, for example, the meetings that they had with Ahmed al-Shara, right? It was clearly.
But they changed his name.
They changed his name. That's why they didn't get prosecuted, right? But I mean, clearly this was they breached Section 12 of the Terrorism Act, and what we're doing is we're saying, oh well, okay, now we understand. All of this is entirely political. All of this entire area is entirely political, and you are prosecuting those that will help you minimize the space of Palestine activism, as opposed to the law being the law, and the law only requiring being dealt with in a certain way. You're telling us, you're informing us by your own actions that all of these decisions are entirely political. And that's partly what we're doing with this application. We're saying that, hey, look, you've got university lecturers who are trying to teach a nuanced view of what's happening in the Middle East. And instead of really thinking about that and allowing students to flourish by having critical thinking and being able to engage in critical exercises, what you're saying is that, well, actually, no, what we want to do is create an environment where lecturers are removed from their positions for allowing students to think for themselves, for giving them material.
Is that happening though, or is it a self kind of
It's one of the cases we mentioned in the application. It's exactly what's happening. One lecturer saying, well, why don't we try and understand what happened on October 7th and the reasons and the causes for why October 7th happened, and then being put through an entire awful disciplinary process because the university acts ultimately as an arm of policing. And we've seen this across, the whole of the university space. We know that, part of bordering now takes place in the university itself, whether it's with students or even lecturers. They're the ones who are doing immigration checks. They're the ones who are doing a kind of playing a role of the border agent within the university system and structure itself. And of course, when it comes to something like counterterrorism, that becomes much more elevated in terms of the role that they play. So, the whole space is being minimized. Even in another university, it's like an independent university, one that I was quite surprised by. The students were just discussing literature around Yahya Sinwar, right? Which of course is a completely normal thing to do, because this is the world that we live in. You cannot simply say, well, students who are interested in international politics,
read those books.
right, can't read those books or can't talk about somebody, right, and have a political opinion about them, okay, without falling foul of Section 12 of the Terrorism Act. Is actually an utterly ridiculous situation that we find ourselves in. But this is how prescription works. And what we're saying to the Home Secretary is, read these cases, see how these people are being affected, understand that by having Section 12 in the way that you have and having Hamas on this list of banned proscribed organizations, what you're doing is you're effectively giving cover to Zionists, right? But you're also having a chilling effect creating a chilling effect throughout society.
Isn't that their aim, though?
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, and that's the reason for the prescription laws. That's entirely the reason for them.
I mean, you mentioned NHS, you mentioned universities, but you also mentioned it's not actually done via the police necessarily. It's other civil society institutions.
Well, this is how chilling effect works, right?
So is deprescribing them going to affect that? Isn't that still going to be the case?
I think what we have to do is create an environment where universities and public bodies and institutions understand that that there are repercussions to the decisions that they make, right? Now, so for example, last week Cage launched an attack against two Zionist organizations based in the UK. It's called Britain's Apartheid Apologists. So we detail UK Lawyers for Israel and the campaign against anti-Semitism. Now, what both of these organizations do is that they weaponize anti-Semitism as a way of providing political cover to Israel. And we've had lots of these cases coming in. So like the cases where people have been accused of supporting Hamas or expressing support for Hamas, in the same way, what these organizations do is that they will write to private and public bodies. So for example, they'll write to Currys, and they'll say to Currys, one of your staff members had a Palestine badge on, and that effectively means that they support the ethnic cleansing of Jews from Israel and that they support Hamas. That's exactly how they write a letter to Currys. Now, we have to make it very, very clear to all of these institutions and to the public, what these organizations are and the way that they operate, which is why we wrote the report. Effectively, what we have are two organizations that are very closely linked to Zionism and Zionists and to settlers and to settler projects to displace Palestinians, who are advocating in many ways on behalf of the continued genocide going on. So rather than just dealing with the cases as they're coming in and saying, oh, well, let's defend this person, why are we not attacking these organizations and exposing them for who they really are, which are apologists for apartheid? And that's an easy win in many ways, because the ICJ last year in its advisory opinion, it declared that Israel is a racially segregated and apartheid state. That is the highest court in the entire world, saying that the international law position on the Zionist state is that it is racially segregated and apartheid. What is the international position on apartheid? That it is completely illegal. Therefore, you cannot have relationships with apartheid. But further than that, it is an international law obligation to resist apartheid and to support those who are fighting against an apartheid regime. So these UK Lawyers for Israel does what it says on the tin. It's literally out there to support Israel itself, which means by virtue of what Israel is constitutionally, they are UK lawyers for ultimately apartheid. That is really what they're saying. How do we have a charitable trust in the UK that's regulated by the Charities Commission that is openly advocating on behalf of an apartheid state? But not only that, writing letters to all these private and public bodies that are ruining the lives of everyday individuals, when it is actually they who should be held to account for their existence in the society and for perpetuating apartheid and narratives in support of apartheid.
So the average person listening or watching who agrees with you, what can they do to be part of this? Because anyone would naturally, be disgusted at the fact that someone, UK lawyers for Israel, would be accusing others of supporting ethnic cleansing, right? Getting people fired and stuff. How do we as average people kind of contribute to making that toxic socially and
I
culturally?
think it's super important that people within their various regulatory frameworks use the research that's been done. It's not just us. There's other people who've done research in these organizations too. Write to their regulatory bodies and say that you have been receiving complaints by these two organizations, Campaigning Against Anti-Semitism, UK Lawyers for Israel. Here are all the reasons why you should not be taking any vexatious complaint by these organizations seriously, and you have an international duty to understand, what role it is that they're playing right now. And I think what would happen from that is that what we can start to do is, at least at the very minimum, stop this kind of continual flood of complaints. Like, Cage has enough work to do dealing with Guantanamo Bay and all the secret prisons and the torture without us having to deal with all of these other cases that are coming in relating to Palestine activism. Not to say that we don't want to help those people.
How many have there been?
Since October the 7th, there was a 500% increase in our caseload. So we're talking about hundreds of cases that have been coming in continually, flooding our inbox of people who need help and support. And that's why there's such an obligation on us to not only help them, but to stop the source of where these complaints are coming from in the first place.
Do you have
which
a
is why
rough
you have to go
ballpark?
upstream.
Rough ballpark, 500% could mean you had one.
Oh, I think
and
it's
then now it's 5.
I think the last figure that I was given by the casework team was like over 500 cases.
Wow.
Yeah. So like significant increase. I think it's even more than that by this stage, and that was like a figure that I was given almost a year ago.
The thing, the dilemma is, we want people to know that this is happening, but we don't want to scare people into silence. Because if you tell people, oh, people are losing their jobs or getting kicked out of school or whatever, then it might naturally, inadvertently make people, put their head down and just kind of get on with it. But how can we address this issue?
So I think, from our experience, what we've seen is actually taking a very strong and ethical stance in relation to Zionism is the best form of defense.
I always say the counter extremism kind of apparatus and people and grifters, they always take the path of least resistance.
Right.
You just tell them to
look,
get
you know
lost
from your own personal history, right? Being labeled an extremist by Priti Patel, and then taking it to court and being aggressive in your approach in relation to that accusation that sometimes when you go on the front foot and you really attack them for what they're saying, that you can actually really push back, not just against them in relation to your case, but against the entire regime. And we're seeing this with lawyers now, we're seeing this with doctors, we're seeing this with so many people. People are now becoming braver, and they're understanding that there's a genocide taking place. This isn't just about me. This is about what's happening to the whole Palestinian movement. And they're saying, well, actually, I don't want to just defend my case. I want to use my case to understand what's happening with Zionism itself. And I want these regulatory bodies to understand that they have to take a position in relation to genocide. They have to take a position in relation to apartheid. So I think if you are going through a disciplinary process, you have to see it as an opportunity that this is a line of defense of Palestine itself, and go on the front foot and attack Zionism and put it to your regulator that ultimately they have to take a position on Zionism itself. And if they don't, they're effectively complicit.
Or they're breaching the international law obligations.
Absolutely.
Does the average, shopkeeper or whatever, or company, Currys, whatever, Do they have any obligation under international law when it comes to this kind of stuff?
I mean, I think that's much more difficult to say, right? Like even international, the way that it operates with public bodies, right? But what we're saying is that, all public bodies have a general duty, right, to act ethically in the world. And so that's what you're leveraging. With private bodies, it is always just about leverage, right? And I think, like with the BDS campaign, I think they need to know and understand that there are consequences to the way that you act and operate in the world. Like if we take, for example, a company like Zara. Zara is not on the BDS list and it doesn't have, as far as we know, any dealings directly with Israel. But the reason why Zara is quite often boycotted, and not just Zara, Bershka, and all of these other companies that are part of that same group, is because of that campaign that they ran, which this kind of modeling campaign for like a range of clothes, which was really despicable. And I think that, they saw the impact of that campaign because people were so horrified by what they did. It hit their bottom line in some ways, and they still haven't, as far as I understood, apologized. They've tried to make an excuse for it, but they never actually issued an apology. But I think it is worthwhile people saying to themselves, well, you have a duty as a company to act ethically in the world. And if you're going to pull stunts that really offend the sensibilities of those who care about what's happening in Palestine, then there's going to be an impact to what you do. And that's the power that we hold as consumers. So it's not so much of a case with private companies that we hold them to account based on their ethics. We hold them account on the basis of their bottom line. And that's really what affects them, to know, okay, this person has been removed from their position from this private company. What do we do about this situation now? And that's actually an act of solidarity amongst ourselves as well. How we connect ourselves not only to that person who's suffering, but also to Palestine. All right, I always say this: Palestine, the front line of what's happening in Palestine, is inside Palestine itself. But that is just a front line. There are lines of defense that are taking place elsewhere in the world, and understanding that our position, especially in the US and the UK, the two places that are most closely linked to the machinery of Zionist violence, that the burden on us is much greater. There's a much greater burden on us to do something than, say, for example, fishermen off the coast of Somalia. That the two are just not the same. There is a higher burden on us to use our position, to use our wealth, to use our resources to affect these situations. And so I think, Cage can produce all this research, we can defend our cases and whatever else, but we actually have to leverage our power as consumers as well in the process of pushing back.
So you mentioned NHS, you mentioned university, you mentioned private companies getting targeted by apologists for apartheid. What other areas of the in civil society, in people's everyday lives, have you seen a chilling effect because of the proscription of Islam?
Well, I think it's pretty much ubiquitous, right? How can you have an effective conversation about what resistance looks like to settler colonization, apartheid, when some of the major groups in the Palestinian region are proscribed as terrorists? Of course, and this is only within really the West. The vast majority of the world does not view them that way, right? It's only the Western countries that do that. But, because this is where we're based, because the machinery of violence is closest here, the conversation in many ways is most important here as well. Because we want people to understand the role that Britain plays in relation to Zionism. We want them to understand the role that it plays in inhibiting an effective resistance to Zionism as well, and how we are inhibited in what we can say and do by that system and structure. And so that's why this application is so important. And even if it's not successful, the reality is that we have such low aspirations for ourselves sometimes, especially as a Muslim community, that we forget that being brave is something that you practically do. It's not something that you keep hidden inside your heart. Bravery isn't something that exists just in a corner of your heart that you put somewhere. It's something that has to be practiced out there in the real world. And quite honestly, like, really, what's the big deal? The law allows us to push back against the prescription of an organization because of the effect that it's having on wider society. We just use the law in order to do what the law allows for. It's really not that deep.
Is there an element of we need to just wake up our community, or just generally citizens in general, that even if it remains prescribed, it's not illegal to talk about it? There's a lot of or to support resistance as a notion, you know, per se. Palestinians have a right to resistance, armed resistance, and you know, these are rights under natural justice or international law, or whatever you want to call it.
That's the fundamental position, right? That the right for resistance exists under international law. Now, we have to say that supporting, right now under the law, that supporting or expressing support for Hamas is a crime, right? So you have to be very, very careful about that, because what will happen is that you will be arrested and you will be prosecuted, and more than likely you will be convicted of doing so, right? But that doesn't inhibit a conversation as well about why the prescription regime is in place and what effect that prescription regime has. And I think it's important that we normalize that conversation without falling into the area of directly expressing support for the organization itself. So those are the two distinctions, and I think that's right. And the reason why that's right is because we have to normalize the idea that the system and the structure itself is carrying out its own violence here in the UK in support of the Zionists. And we can only do that by really explaining how they've created a system and structure of laws that inhibit genuine support for the entirety of Palestinian resistance and not just segments of it.
What does accountability look like for any institution, any public body or private, whatever, if they kind of going out of their way to try and stifle conversations about Palestine and support for Palestinian resistance?
Well, this is where, again, I come back to mobilization, right? I think what accountability looks like, say, for example, with the GMC, is doctors banding together, coming together, nurses coming together, all healthcare workers coming together and saying that, you know, you are playing a role in perpetuating the genocide by stifling freedom of speech for your staff members, by playing this role of effectively policing what is permissible in relation to speaking about Palestine. I think that's key. It is really for those within those regulatory frameworks to push back. But the problem is that, you know, unfortunately, we have a situation where most people worry more often than anything else about their own bottom line, which is fine. That's a fair thing. Everyone has their own difficulties in their life that they have to contend with. But ultimately, what happens is that if we don't deal with the repression, the space becomes increasingly minimized. And what we're trying to do is say, no, actually, we have to maximize the space of conversation as much as possible. And the only way that we can do that is by having each other's backs. That's it. It's not anything more complicated than that. When people come together and they stand together for one another, then you have the ability to actually change policy. But the problem is that if you become siloed and you see that person as somebody you don't want to become like, then instinctively what that does is that minimizes you as a person in terms of your own freedom of speech and freedom of expression. So you end up self-policing your own ethics and your own values and the role that you should be playing in relation to what's going on in the world, because you're scared about what happened to somebody else. But actually you should be doing the opposite. You should be saying, oh, that person is going through something very, very difficult right now. What I need to do is I need to find ways to support that person in order to ensure that my own rights are not affected in any way.
Do you think that's happening? I mean, you've been around for, you know, a few decades, longer than I have. But what do you think of the state, the health of British democracy, British citizenship, of people, you know, people's rights, people's, even a subjective feeling of power or being surveilled or being restricted or disenfranchised. What's the trajectory in your view? Because for me, it seems like now, it seems to me like obviously there was kind of war on terror, there was a bit of a lull when Prevent was kind of introduced, but it seems just subjectively that the trajectory is headed in a good direction. But it could just be because, the people I'm kind of exposed to. But you have obviously Cage are exposed to the people that slip through the net, or people that are at the front line, so to speak, of kind of state suppression and stuff, or institutional, structural oppression. Where do you see this going? How healthy is our society?
I think one of the most amazing things that we've seen post 7th October 2023 is the student movement. Young people, both in universities and schools, but also in the online space, have really shown that there is a desperation to see a just and fair world. And that's one of the things that's actually motivated me a lot since over the last couple of years, seeing and being around young people, giving talks to student encampments, delivering training to them. Sometimes I like doing it just because I walk away enthused by their energy, as much as it is about them saying that they want to kind of like learn about some aspect of the work or whatever else.
This generation of students is more fearless than the last.
Absolutely. And in some ways, this could be our Vietnam moment, because they are really, and they're not backing down either, right? So they're being suppressed. The universities are trying their best to close the encampments, but they're finding innovative ways of carrying out their actions. We've done interviews before in the past where we've spoken about Palestine Action and the type of other actions that are taking place where they're trying to shut down weapons factories. All of this is operating together. And obviously we've seen massive marches happening regularly through London. Now, what we have to ensure is that the energy that's been created by this devastating genocide, this immense loss of life, doesn't all go into a manufactured resolution that suits Zionism. This energy has to be taken towards the inevitable point, which has to be a one democratic state for the whole of the Palestinian occupied territory. That if this movement turns into some kind of like tepid two-state Palestinian Authority run solution, where the system and the structure of repression remains the same, where apartheid is still, and racial segregation is still the lived reality of the occupied territory, then all those lives are for nothing. Then everything that Gazans have been through, everything that those in the West Bank had been through, it is for nothing. Because, ultimately, we'd have just returned back to zero. And then, we'll have to wait until the next round of violence flares up, and then everybody will get completely horrified. But until we bring everyone back to the central need, and the central need is what? To end Zionism as an ideology and as a political structure, that imagination for a just future will never come into being. And I think young people understand that just future is around the corner. And that is what they're working towards, and I'm very proud to spend time with them and to work with them to work towards that.
So on the topic of, you mentioned kind of one state solution, one democratic state. Some apologists for Israel, the Zionist project, they've been kind of likening so-called Israel to the US and Australia and stuff like that, kind of, these distantly colonized and ethnically cleansed. Oh, it was bad when it happened, but it's there now. It's like saying at the end of Israel is like saying the end of America or Australia or something. For young people today who weren't alive, like you're a history buff as well, you know about probably dozens of countries that popped in and out of existence in the last 100 years or so. Can you give some examples of how this is actually possible, that this, there were countries and colonized kind of little white colonies in Africa, for example, I don't know, Rhodesia or
Well, Algeria, I
wherever.
think, is one of the best examples where settler colonialism was in operation, right? And you have
So it's not just a one-way street. It can be.
it can be reversed. And of course, you know what you have with Algeria is like really difficult and controversial types of violence taking place. You have, you know, young women like Zohra Drif, who takes it upon herself to plant a bomb in a civilian cafe in a settler colony part of Algiers, right? Why did she do this? Because when you go through her story, and her autobiography is amazing and very much, you know, she wasn't just like some, you know, peasant girl. She was very, very well educated in French schools and universities in Algeria, but could see the daily indignities, right? But now we celebrate, you know, through movies like the Battle of Algiers, Pontecovo's movie, you know, we celebrate the Algerian resistance, we celebrate Algeria's freedom, right? That Algeria in many ways becomes a model for understanding how, at one point, how the resistance is so significantly demonized, can come through that process and be lauded as something that was righteous later. And that doesn't mean that certain types of violence aren't difficult for us to countenance. They are. I mean, violence is violence. And people keep going about women and children, women and children. Violence against men is also problematic. Like, you know, it is a difficult world out there. But the reality is that, you know, when you lived under settler colonialism and occupation and apartheid for 100 years, at some point violence and will flare up and will continue to flare up. But it's the structure of injustice, the systemic nature of injustice that you have to learn from. On the other side, we have another violent movement through the ANC in South Africa that fought for its struggle as well. People don't focus on that element. They just focus on, well, Nelson Mandela was a peacemaker and whatever else. Yeah, but once upon a time he was building bombs specifically to attack, you know, colonial targets. People don't want to engage in that part of history because it's easier for them to think of him as a peacemaker. But, you know, Andy Clarno talks about this in his book, Neoliberal Apartheid, and it's a really important book for people to read. He looks at post-1994 South Africa, and he looks at the Palestinian Authority in post-Oslo. And what he's showing is that what happened post-apartheid is that that post-apartheid period created the most unequal society on earth today, according to UN statistics. So how do we go from a legal structure of segregation and inequality to an economically worse situation, right? Was the political vote worth it? And this is the lesson he's trying to learn for the post-Oslo period in Palestine, that, okay, you're putting so much stock in the two-state solution and in having political autonomy, but what does that get you long-term? Do you end up with, like South Africa, where inequality is what reigns the entire model for the future of those people? Which is why, you know, looking back at history is so important. You know, we want to look at Algeria, but we also want to look at South Africa when we're thinking about not only how do we resist, but how do we come into a just future for the world. And I don't think it's okay for us to just simply say, well, you know, as long as we recognize that Palestine is a state, that everything will be okay, because the fundamental problem that we have here in this entire, the elephant in the room is always Zionism.
Yeah. So you mentioned a few books. I was going to actually ask you to mention a few books for people that you recommend reading list. I mean, it's just something that popped in my head. You know, on the way here, I was listening to Dave Chappelle talking about a book he read before, like when he was very young, and it kind of really helped his resilience as well when it comes to, you know, what people say about you, which is and the fear of kind of the public spectacle, which is a collection of all the reporting against Muhammad Ali, rahimahullah, when he refused to, you know, go to Vietnam. Right. And just attack after attack after attack. And obviously, at the end, he was proven right. He was lauded a hero and so forth. So I think things like this, discourses like this, really helps strengthen people's resolve in the face of, okay, it's unpopular in the here and now, but, you know, later down the line. So what advice, what reading list maybe can you give young people, old people, when it comes to navigating this period?
Immediately, one of the most profound books that I've read in a while, very recently, just came out a couple of months ago, is Perfect Victims by Mohammed Al-Kurd. just a phenomenal reflection on the difficulty of the mournability of Palestinian life in the world that we live in today. It's a really profound series of reflections. Definitely recommend Andy Clarno's book, Neoliberal Apartheid, for people who want to understand what the future of Palestine might hold, especially from an economic perspective. I mean, now that I mentioned it, Zahra Idris's autobiography, just really, really, really an incredible work. Based on what you just said, one book that came to my mind is Gianthea Harris's book called A More Beautiful and Terrible History. And the reason why I like that book a lot is that what she charts is the life of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King in the way that it was understood at the time of their civil rights activism by the powers to be, so by the FBI and the government and whoever, right? And the way that they were demonized and criminalized. And she looks at the way in which they're remembered now. And what she does is that she shows us how liberals in particular try to own a narrative about the past that simply is not true, that simply never existed, right? And Umar al-Aqad talks about in his book that one day we will all have been against this, right? But the point that Jian's making is that at the time that the violence is taking place, they were all for it. They were all for the violence. And we think about people like David Cameron and Margaret Thatcher and their public statements in relation to Nelson Mandela, literally calling him to be lynched, right? But of course, many years later celebrate him as a wonderful figure of peace and whatever. So it's so important that we understand what the history is. And even I would actually encourage people to read Alia Izetbegovich's Inescapable Questions, which unfortunately I think is out of print now, but I'm sure somebody somewhere can find a PDF at the very least. But like all of these books, they all help us to understand why we shouldn't allow for the past to be reframed by the colonizers of today, right? Which is what they always try and do. You know, with Bosnia, the West imposed the arms embargo, which allowed for the massacre of Bosniak lives. And at the end, come in at the end and say, oh, we're here to help, right? But everybody was dead by then. In Kosovo, it was the same thing. Everybody is dead by the time that NATO decides to start bombing Serbian targets, right? They always wait till the end. Rwanda was the same thing. Everyone was dead by the time everyone said, oh, it's really terrible what's happening. That's exactly what's happening in Gaza today. That, you know, how many lives does it take before the West to actually say, well, now is enough? And that's part of the problem, that we're always waiting for the West to say now is enough. And we need to find ways of making sure that happens sooner. Okay, well, Jazakallah khair. I did ask ChatGPT, actually, I fed the document, you sent the legal argument to it, and I said, can you give me some hardball questions to come devil's advocate style questions? And they're all pretty pants, really. I think you've addressed them all anyway. But is there anything that you want to get across? Anything that maybe a good argument from any detractor, or a critique against the application that you want to address, or you want to kind of preempt? I mean, look, our detractors are never going to accept the arguments we're making because they're ideologically tied to a notion of Zionism that perpetuates injustice in the world. And I think, as my colleague Frank McGuinness always says, that Zionism is in terminal crisis. I think it's time for them to understand that Zionism is in terminal crisis, that injustice cannot remain, and that we will not simply allow for there to be a Zionist state that exists in this world and that has support and influence, especially in the countries that we live in, without it being held to account. And so it's more of a warning than it is anything else. Okay, on that note, thanks for joining us, and Jazakumullah khairan at home for watching as well. If you like this podcast, as usual, give a like and a share, and let us know in the comments below how you feel. If you have any comments, questions, anything to put to Dr. Asim Qureshi next time. Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.